In the last lecture, we encountered a new kind of ruler, well-educated according to humanist principles, ambitious, hard-headed, and ruthless. As the Middle Ages came to an end, the crowned heads of Europe sought to make themselves more powerful and less beholden to the goodwill of the church, the aristocracy, or their subjects generally. They did so by employing armies of propagandists, writers, painters, composers. Even mapmakers could be useful in projecting their power, and when all else failed, soldiers. But art and war cost money, and therein lay the rub. What good was it to overawe your subjects with fancy palaces and powerful armies when you had to beg them for the money to pay for it all? Renaissance princes knew that excessive taxation might kill their economies, disgruntle their subjects, and raise the importance of legislative and tax-gathering bodies like Parliament and the Estates General. Renaissance princes, if they were to be truly as powerful as Machiavelli would have them, needed lots of money, no questions asked. One source of funds would have been the rich trade with the East. Europeans were crazy for fabrics, spices, medicines from China, India, and the Middle East. Now, everyone knew that Venice, Genoa, Florence, and Milan had grown wealthy on this trade. That's why France and the Holy Roman Emperor tried to conquer Italy, as we've seen. But in 1453, the Ottoman Empire conquered Constantinople, complicating an important trade route to the east. Anyone who wanted Eastern goods had to go through Muslim merchants. Was there no way around the Muslims and the Italians? The answer to that question was supplied from, of all places, Portugal. Now, in the 14th century, Portugal had been a relatively poor country ruled by the House of Aviz. Like Spain, it was partly controlled by the Moors until a series of campaigns of expulsion drove them out. It was frequently threatened to be absorbed by Castile. And the powerful Cortes limited the king's power. Henry the Navigator, the son of King John, who ruled from 1385 to 1433, began to explore alternative sources of wealth as a way to increase the power of the House of Aviz and reduce that dependence on the Cortes. Beginning in 1419, he founded a college to train seamen. He sent successive expeditions down the west coast of Africa. These expeditions perfected the caravel, which became the great sort of prototypical ship for exploration during this period of time. They established trade routes. They explored the coast. And always they were on the lookout for a way to turn east. In other words, the great question for this college was, does Africa end? This led to a century of exploration, the beginnings of European imperialism, and many fringe benefits for the Portuguese monarchy. Like so. Beginning in 1415, Portuguese mariners had already captured Ceuta in Morocco. This became a foothold in Africa. Later, it was used to capture Tangier. By 1419, they'd explored the Madeira Islands. In 1427, the Azores. Both became centers of sugar production, which became a very lucrative trade. People in Europe love sugar. And also a set of way stations on the way south and on the way west. Portuguese mariners made it to Cape Verde by 1444, Sierra Leone in 1460. They founded a major fort at Elmina, Ghana in 1482, establishing relations with the King of the Congo in the interior. That would lead to a brisk trade in first gold and later slaves. Bartholomew Diaz reached the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, and this was the moment when the Portuguese realized you could possibly circle Africa. 10 years later, Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape, reached India, and returned with ships laden with the wealth of the East. His profit was 60 times the cost of the voyage. The result was a Portuguese seafaring empire based on trade with Africa and the East. After Columbus laid the foundations for Spanish power in the Americas, we'll talk about that in a few minutes, the Pope worked out the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. As a result of this treaty, Portugal was given free run of everything east of a line 370 miles east of the Cape Verde Islands. I have 3 points to make about this. First, this treaty and the explorations that led up to it would lay the foundations of Portuguese Brazil. Pedro Alvarez de Cabral, hoping to repeat da Gama's success, actually strayed too far west and bumped into Brazil in 1500. My second point is that, as in Africa, the Portuguese would establish trading posts, which would supply wood, red dye, and later valuable sugarcane to Portugal. This expedition and series of expeditions was based upon new knowledge acquired through science and exploration. But it was also, and this is my third point, based on European arrogance. Were any of the native peoples ever consulted by the Pope in drawing this line? Of course not. Under Manuel I, known as Manuel the Fortunate, he ruled from 1495 to 1521, Portugal became a great naval power. The Portuguese conquered Goa in India in 1510, Malacca, now Melaka, in Malaysia in 1511, the Moluccas in present-day Indonesia by 1514, and the Hormuz Island in the Persian Gulf in 1515. They opened up trade with China and established relations with Ethiopia. Now, in fact, the Portuguese Empire wasn't really a colonizing empire. Lots of Portuguese did not leave their homeland to establish a sort of new Portugal. It was mainly, simply based on trade. By the mid-16th century, Portugal had begun to experience decline, in part because of the attempt to keep up Spain. It became overextended. It had troops and a navy on station around the globe. It was pressured by Spain, among other things, in terms of religion. The Spanish kings wanted the Portuguese to expel their Jews and Moors, and the Portuguese reluctantly did this. This was a mistake, because it destroyed much of the old Portuguese middle class. In 1536, the King of Portugal introduced the Inquisition, also following the Spanish example. In 1580, the House of Aviz came to an end with the death of Henry I. There were 6 claimants to the throne, but the most powerful was Philip II of Spain, for reasons we're about to learn. He took over, and as a result, Spain ruled Portugal for 60 years. This is known in Portuguese history as the 60 Years' Captivity. During this period of time, the Portuguese lost the Indian trade to the Dutch. The Dutch occupied Brazil. Eventually, the Portuguese revolted, actually repeatedly, against Spain in 1634, 1637, and finally, successfully, in 1640. After 1640, a new dynasty, the Braganza, took over and managed to expel the Dutch from Brazil. Now, this is a great and largely unknown story, but its greatest significance is that other European powers began to emulate the actions of Portugal, most notably Spain. Now, as we have seen, Spain was only united under Ferdinand and Isabella at the end of the 15th century. So of all of the great nations of Europe, Spain was in some ways the most recent and untried. Economically, it was much poorer than France or the Holy Roman Empire, and had gotten late in on the Portuguese Eastern trade. This helps to explain why the dual monarchs listened when a Genoese sailor named Cristoforo Colombo, or Cristobal Colon in Spanish, approached them with a radical idea, that the way to reach the fabled East was to head west. Now, contrary to popular belief, most educated Europeans did not think the world was flat. The Greeks had proposed a round Earth, and sailors knew about the curvature of the Earth. What they did not know was how big the Earth was. The fear wasn't that Columbus would sail off the edge, but that he would just sail and sail and sail. Now, in fact, Columbus's instincts were right, but his math was all wrong. He thought that Asia extended much farther east than it did. He underestimated the circumference of the Earth. He thought that Japan was 2,760 miles west of the Canary Islands. In fact, it's about 12,000 miles. No one in Europe suspected that 2 vast continents lay in the way. In 1491, after much wrangling, the Spanish government agreed to the voyage. Here is one of the few places where I almost get to say, and the rest is history. But I'll tell you a little bit about the voyage. Columbus left Spain in early August, left the Canary Islands in early September. That was his last Spanish landfall. His ships carried provisions for a year. Now, Columbus preferred dead reckoning and his gut experience at sea to celestial navigation. By early October, not having sighted anything, the crew was growing restive. But after midnight, on the 12th of October, 1492, a lookout named Rodrigo de Triana spotted land. Now, Rodrigo was supposed to get a nice pension out of this, but Columbus claimed it for himself. Columbus landed in what is now the Dominican Republic later that day. He raised the royal standard, claiming the island for Ferdinand and Isabella. he traded with the Indians, called Tainos, a branch of the Arawaks. He founded a settlement called La Navidad, and he returned to Spain, accompanied by exotic natives, parrots, and gold. He was greeted with many honors. He was dubbed the Admiral of the Ocean Sea. He was given 1,000 doubloons and 17 ships for a return voyage. And it was as a result of Columbus's first voyage that the Pope had drawn up that Treaty of Tordesillas that we mentioned earlier. If Portugal got all the lands east of the line, Spain got all the lands to the west. Thus, the Pope divided the New World between Spain and Portugal in 1494. Now, as you know, Columbus died thinking that he had reached the Indies. Even after 3 more voyages, he was convinced that he had discovered the route to the east, and it was he who dubbed the natives Indians. But as other sailors came back from the new Spanish claims, the Spanish crown began to figure out that it hadn't reached the East Indies at all, but something far more exotic and, who knew, lucrative. In 1513, Vasco de Balboa discovered the Pacific Ocean. In 1519, the one surviving ship from Magellan's circumnavigation arrived in Spain and reported just how big that ocean was. It took 93 days to cross the Pacific. It was at this point that the Spaniards realized that they could concede the East to Portugal and still have an entire new world at their disposal. At this point, the Spanish ceased to be exploradores and became conquistadors. In the same year, 1519, Hernán de Cortés conquered an advanced Aztec civilization in Mexico, unused to guns and especially horses. In 1531, Francisco Pizarro did the same thing to the Incas. Spain's discovery of the New World is, of course, a totally Eurocentric concept. From the point of view of the natives of these lands, it was an old world. It was their world. There was nothing to discover. That mutual myopia, the European refusal to see things from the natives' point of view, and the Native American failure to understand the implications of European expansion was a recipe for disaster. I'd like to talk about the effects of the discovery of this new world on both the native populations and on Europeans. First, the Indians would mostly die, either in futile resistance to men on horseback with guns or from European diseases that they had never encountered before, including smallpox, chickenpox, whooping cough, diphtheria, malaria, measles, yellow and spotted fever, and even the bubonic plague. A population of perhaps 50 million people in 1492 was reduced to 5 million by 1700. The survivors were enslaved to work the plantations and the gold and silver mines of Mexico and Peru. Some eventually intermarried with their conquerors, producing new peoples. When the native populations began to die out, both Spain and Portugal began to import slaves culled from Africa. Eventually, some 10 million people were abducted, sold, and transported. About a third died on the voyage. Those who didn't die were exploited in the New World. We'll talk more about the African slave trade in a later lecture. For now, you should understand that Columbus's discovery brought misery to 3 continents: South America, North America, and Africa. Now, it is true, of course, that the Aztec and Incan civilizations that the Spanish destroyed were also cruel and exploitative, and that most enslaved Africans had been captured in tribal wars or raids by other Africans. In fact, all of these continents were riven by cruel tribal warfare. But European civilization gave African kings an extra incentive for such warfare, and it replaced the Aztec and Incan empires with something that was even more destructive of humanity and the environment. So what was the effect of all this on Europeans? Intellectually, the European worldview was blown apart. The New World was hitherto unsuspected. It was full of civilizations, some of them quite advanced, that did things differently. It was full of men and women who hadn't heard of Christ or the Christian God and who arranged themselves in different economic and social patterns. Men and women literally in the state of nature, at least from a European point of view, which would cause European philosophers to stop to think really hard about what was intrinsic to humanity and what was constructed by culture. More on that later. Of course, neither the kings of Spain nor Portugal nor their commanders cared a fig for these abstruse questions. To them, the New World was a vast treasure house given to them by the Christian God to exploit. Silver, in particular, flooded into Spain via biannual treasure fleets. Now, admittedly, these had a distressing tendency to be sunk by Caribbean storms or by English privateers, but enough would get through to make the Spanish crown fabulously wealthy and Spain the dominant power in Europe for 150 years. That wealth enabled subsequent Spanish monarchs like Charles I and Philip II to launch more expeditions, raise vast armies and navies, maintain a vast worldwide empire. In fact, much of Spain's wealth would bankroll Charles V's wars to hold on to the Holy Roman Empire and Philip II's to stamp out Protestantism, as we'll learn in a later lecture. Both, in the end, had disastrous results for the Spanish monarchy. In fact, there's a really good question as to whether all this treasure actually did anything for Spain in the long run. Apart from the merchants in Seville and the king, nobody else seems to have managed to profit out of the treasure from the New World. Some historians think that the silver flooding into Europe also destabilized the European economy, leading to spiraling inflation in the 17th century. By the way, I should explain that spiraling inflation was about 4% a year. That may not sound like much to us, but to a world coming out of the Middle Ages in which prices and wages had been fixed for decades, if not centuries, it was disastrous enough. Finally, the last effect of the Spanish discovery of the New World was that other countries noted Spain's quick rise to power and wealth and wanted to jump on the bandwagon. But in this case, too, geography, along with timing, was destiny. Unfortunately for the French, the English, and the Dutch, they were just too late and too north to make a quick quantum leap in wealth or status from American exploration. That is, if you sail due west from France, England, or the Netherlands, you don't hit the sunny Caribbean. In the 1580s, the French began to explore and control Canada, the upper Midwest, and the Mississippi Valley. Americans are quite familiar with French place names commemorating French explorers like De La Salle, Father Marquette, Cadillac. Father Marquette's name reminds us that much of the impetus here, as with Spain, was religious. Jesuits established numerous missions. But these settlements did not at first lead to any tremendous wealth. They supplied furs and pelts and Grand Banks fish to France. That's about it. In particular, France forbade Protestants from settling in Canada, now thus eliminating Canada as a social safety valve and eliminating the usefulness of the colonies to the whole of French society. That will be important later. Only in the late 17th century would France aim to exploit its base in North America under the mercantilist policies of Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Let's turn to England. The first exploratory voyages took place soon after Columbus, 1497-98, but they failed to find a northwest or northeast passage to Asia. The English didn't really start to think seriously about the Americas until Elizabeth's reign. At first, they just wanted to cash in on Spanish trade, hence the early slaving voyages by John Hawkins in the 1560s. But by the 1560s, the Spanish had built up a colonial and trading infrastructure, and in 1568, Spanish guardacostas attacked an English slaving fleet. This led to a covert war between Spain and England. English privateers like Hawkins, Sir Francis Drake, and Sir Martin Frobisher sought to intercept and confiscate Spanish fleets or sack Spanish ports in the New World. In other words, Drake, Hawkins, Frobisher were terrorists. As with many modern-day terrorists, there was even a religious dimension. The English were Protestants, the Spanish were Catholics. And as with modern-day terrorists, they were supported by a state that denied their existence. Elizabeth I repeatedly denied to Philip II that she could do anything about Hawkins and Drake. I don't know what's wrong with these people. I try to control them. And in fact, she was secretly funding them and taking a cut of the profits. This covert war became official in the 1580s when Philip decided to launch the Spanish Armada. By this time, the English saw the advantages to establishing their own colonies in the New World. They could be used as military and naval bases against Spanish colonies, as trading posts and sources of raw materials. And unlike the French, the English used their colonies as a safety valve for excess population. That is, for people unable to find work or conform in religion. For example, Puritans, who didn't accept the moderate theology of the Church of England. The 1580s saw a series of failed attempts by Elizabethan courtiers to colonize the eastern seaboard, culminating in the lost colony of Roanoke. The first successful English colony in the Americas was founded in 1607 by a consortium headed by Sir Thomas Smith of the Virginia Company. It was established at the headwaters of a river they named the James, after England's new Stuart king, and the settlement they called Jamestown. Now, the purpose of Jamestown was to mine gold. When no gold was found, Virginia doesn't seem to have a lot of gold. I'd be digging under the foundation of the teaching company if it did. When no gold was found, the earliest colonists proved incapable of growing crops or getting along with the Native American population. The colony only began to hit its economic stride in the 1610s. It discovered a marketable commodity: tobacco. The smoking of tobacco was just beginning to be popular in England, despite the prescient opposition of King James, who wrote a counterblast to tobacco in 1604. In the 1620s, the colony then discovered a cheap source of labor: African slaves. And so the cruel foundations of the plantation economy were laid. If you want to be cynical about it, you could say that the first successful Anglo-Saxon settlement in the New World was founded on cancer, racism, and greed. The colonization of Massachusetts began with the Plymouth settlement on Cape Cod in 1620 on the Virginia Company charter. In 1629, the Massachusetts Bay Company was chartered to establish a much larger settlement around Boston, absorbing the Plymouth settlement finally in 1691. Now, its charter, that is the Massachusetts Bay Company, allowed for self-government, and its leaders consciously set out to found a Puritan New Jerusalem, a city on a hill, where Puritan liturgy, morality, and social conventions could be enforced, free from the persecution of the Church of England. They encouraged whole Puritan congregations to immigrate, and in keeping with Puritan doctrine, they banned other religious groups, Catholic superstitions such as traditional Christmas celebrations and calendar festival. Put another way, the Puritans came to America for religious freedom, all right, but for themselves, not for anyone else. Those Massachusetts Bay colonists who came for economic opportunity chafed under the intolerant religious regime. In other words, you get people who would immigrate to Massachusetts just because they wanted land. They weren't particularly interested in this particular religious orientation. That intolerance eventually drove a Salem clergyman named Roger Williams to found Rhode Island as a haven for a wider variety of Protestants as well as Jews. In 1632, George Calvert Lord Baltimore, a Catholic, founded Maryland. Later in the 17th century, Maryland became a haven for Catholics. So, in the end, the English colonies of the New World actually had very limited commercial or military value, but they were an increasingly important safety valve for those who could neither abide nor prosper in Anglican village society. By 1642, some 60,000 people had crossed the Atlantic to found an English society in North America. This was much larger than the French population, and that will be very important in the 17th and 18th centuries as the English and French come to blows over who's going to control this part of the world. The English government also sought to encourage the development of other markets for English products. There was just one problem here. There's only really one English product during this period of time. It's wool. They chartered a series of monopolistic trading companies to other areas. There's the Muscovy Company, the Spanish Company, the Eastland Company, the Turkey, later the Levant Company, the Senegal Adventurers, later the Royal Africa Company, and the East India Company, all chartered between about 1555 and 1600. Now, the problem with this should be clear from the names on the list. How many of these regions really are desperate for wool? Sure, Muscovy, the Baltic, but the Levant, India, probably not. Most ended up making their profits out of importing silks and cottons and tea and spices and medicines from India and the Levant, timber and naval stores from the Baltic, and, in the case of the Royal Africa Company, African human beings shipped to the Americas. Each of these companies held a royal monopoly, and as in Spain, their real beneficiaries were the king, courtiers who greased the wheels of influence, the merchants who were members, and the ports, which did most of the business. In other words, they did nothing to really enrich the country. Only the East India Company had the potential to do so because it was founded as a joint stock company. That is, none of the previous companies were really investment opportunities. By company, I really mean a guild. In other words, you had to be a member of the Muscovy Company in order to trade with Russia. But in the case of the East India Company, you could buy stock in the company, which mounted its own voyages. And so, as with all joint stock companies, profit and loss were shared. Unfortunately, the late start of the English East India Company led to clashes with the French, and especially the Dutch, who had basically gotten to the Indian Ocean first. In 1623, the Dutch massacred an English trading colony at Amboina in the Moluccas. From this point on, all the East India Companies, the French, the Dutch, and the English, fought literal trade war for the trade of the Far East. By the late 17th century, they armed their ships as men of war, they fielded vast armies against each other, but they also used those armies to intimidate local rulers into acceptance of their trade. Now, for the English, this would all pay off after 1700. In the meantime, in the 17th century, the 1600s, the great trading nation would increasingly be the Dutch. The Dutch had spent most of the later 16th century fighting Spain for their independence. That is to say, they rebelled in the 1560s and fought a long, in effect, insurgency against Spain that lasted until 1609. It was only in that year that the Spanish called a truce. Full independence of the Netherlands as a separate country wasn't recognized until the Treaty of Munster of 1648. The Netherlands became a federation of self-governing provinces, sending representatives to a legislative body called the States General. Its executive was an elected officer called a stadtholder. In other words, the Dutch founded a republic, the most important republic in early modern Europe. This republic granted de facto religious toleration to Catholics, various Protestant sects, and Jews. So it's a model of toleration. It produced a vibrant urban culture, and it was based on a commercial economy. Even before independence, Dutch sailors and traders began to move into the Far East. By the mid-17th century, they dominated its trade. Their first important venture was to Java in 1600. Remember, I told you they got there just before the English. Then there was a series of trading voyages establishing trading posts in Africa, Tasmania, the Cape of Good Hope, but especially in the Far East. The Dutch East India Company was chartered in 1602. It established trading colonies in the Moluccas, or Spice Islands, and in 1619 founded Batavia, now Jakarta, in western Java. As with the Portuguese, this company wasn't interested really in territory. It wanted economically strategic locations and trading posts. A Dutch West India Company was later established that established colonies in the West Indies, Curaçao, later St. Martin, North America at New Amsterdam in 1624, Pernambuco, Brazil in 1630. The Dutch were moving into Brazil because of Portuguese weakness by then. They also captured Portuguese slaving stations in West Africa. The tide turned a little bit in the 1650s. In 1654, the Portuguese drove the Dutch from Brazil, and in 1664, the Dutch lost New Amsterdam to the British, who renamed it New York. Still, all of this economic activity contributed to the Dutch miracle of the 17th century. For a while, the Netherlands was the wealthiest trading nation on earth. Amsterdam became the commercial and financial center of Europe. This resulted in the golden age of Dutch art, in part because that art was patronized by wealthy burghers. So, all of Europe seemed to be racing to catch up with Spain, all except Germany. The Holy Roman Empire never really engaged in the exploration game and never acquired any major overseas trades or colonies that it could exploit. Think about it. You've never heard of the Schmidt expedition. Why? Perhaps once again, geography is destiny. The Holy Roman Empire was virtually landlocked compared to the Atlantic powers, and certainly it was badly placed to try for either Eastern or Western trade. Or was it a lack of will? After all, the North Germans had always been distinguished sailors, so what stopped them here? Was it the fact that the Holy Roman Emperor is a Habsburg and connected to Spain, and so the fact that the Spanish explored the New World sort of gave the Germans a pass? In any case, the failure of the Germans to engage in the great game of European imperialism until the 19th century had far-reaching consequences. It led to three very crucial P's, if you will. First, poverty. The Holy Roman Emperor never figured out a financial mechanism to pay his armies beyond taxation and consulting the Diet. In other words, he, alone among the great Renaissance princes, remained poor. Because he remained poor, he remained relatively weak. As a result of this weakness, he remained an elected chairman of a board of some 300 kingdoms, duchies, counties, and dioceses. This will in turn go a long way to explain why the topic of the next lecture, the Protestant Reformation, could happen in only one place in Europe, the one empire named so ironically, Holy and Roman.